There are moments on live television that feel less like interviews and more like tectonic plates shifting beneath the studio floor. And on this fictional morning, under the blinding white heat of the network lights, one of those moments was quietly assembling itself behind the scenes. Long before cameras rolled, long before millions tuned in, and long before a single word was spoken, most viewers had no idea what they were about to witness. Producers didn't know. Staff didn't know. Even the control room, packed elbow to elbow with caffeine and nerves, didn't know all they saw on the rundown was a standard segment. David Muir interviews Karoline Leavitt. Nothing more, nothing less. The kind of pairing that normally gets a predictable spike in ratings and a few clips circulating online before everyone moves on. But that's the thing about live television. The biggest explosions never come with warning labels. The studio audience filed in expecting a routine political debate. Some polite jabs, a little tension, maybe a sharp exchange if things got spicy. Instead, they were about to watch a moment that would shatter the internet so completely that even the network's social team wouldn't be able to keep up. Not because of yelling, not because of chaos, but because of something much more dangerous on live TV. Controlled silence. To understand what happened, you have to step back and look at the two people at that desk. Two personalities who, in this fictional universe, were on a collision course long before the cameras ever turned on. David Muir, a man whose voice had walked Americans through wars, tragedies, historic elections, and stories that shaped decades calm. Composed, steady as bedrock. In this fictionalized version, he was the journalist people trusted when the world made no sense. He didn't perform. He didn't grandstand. He didn't need to be loud. His power came from stillness, the kind of stillness that could freeze even the boldest guest in their tracks. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt. Not the real Karoline, but a dramatized, fictionalized version built for this narrative. In this world, she was rising fast, sharp-tongued, energized, and unapologetically aggressive, a disruptor by branding, a firestorm by style, the kind of guest producers booked when they wanted sparks, not symmetry. She was known for taking over interviews, flattening hosts with relentless talking points, and never letting silence breathe long enough for a counterpunch. Her strategy was simple. Stay loud, stay fast, stay unshakable. Until she met someone even harder to shake. The morning of the broadcast didn't feel unusual, at least not on the surface. David arrived the way he always did. Calm, early, jacket draped over his arm, a coffee, a stack of notes he probably didn't need, and that trademark composure that made young reporters whisper, "How does he stay like that?" Karoline, on the other hand, paced the hall like a fighter backstage at a title match. Her team huddled around her, feeding her lines, reminding her which buzzwords would go viral, which statements would light up TikTok, which phrases would play best on morning talk, shows that thrive on friction. "Stay on offense," one aide muttered. "Don't let him control the tempo," another whispered. "If he tries to pivot, go harder," someone else added. In this fictional world, Karoline wasn't preparing for a conversation. She was preparing for combat. By the time both guests entered the studio, the audience was buzzing, literally buzzing, whispering, leaning forward in their seats. Everyone could sense something in the air, something electric, something about to snap. But even then, no one had any idea. The broadcast opened exactly the way millions had seen it 1,000 times. David welcomed viewers with a calm smile, his voice a low hum of familiarity. Karoline sat across from him, posture stiff, eyes bright and ready. The first question was simple, almost too simple, a soft opener. In this fictional dramatization, David asked something about leadership and public trust, the kind of question that should have set the tone for a calm exchange. Instead, Karoline pounced like the question itself was a challenge. She pivoted, fast, sharper than the producers expected, and suddenly she wasn't answering anymore. She was attacking, not aggressively, not cruelly, but strategically, theatrically, the way a fictional politician in a dramatized script might. Her voice rose, her hands moved. She spoke in practiced rhythms, her sentences layered with the kind of intensity that made viewers lean closer to their screens. And through all of it, David didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't counter. He didn't even blink. He just watched. You could feel the audience shift the way people do when something in the air changes, a slight murmur. A breath held longer than it should be, people glancing around as if silently asking, "Is he really not going to respond?" Karoline seemed to interpret his calm as weakness. She pushed harder, speeding up her cadence, raising her intensity, doubling down on every fictional accusation. And the more she escalated, the quieter he became. That's when the audience began to realize the truth. David wasn't being silent because he had no answer. He was being silent because he was preparing one. This fictionalized moment stretched like a rubber band pulled too far, seconds that felt like minutes, tension tightening until the entire room felt one breath away from snapping. Finally, after Karoline delivered her longest tirade yet, after her voice echoed through the rafters like a rallying cry sharpened to a point, David leaned forward slightly, only slightly, but enough for everyone to pay attention. That's when it happened. The moment that would spin through TikTok before the show even went to commercial. In this dramatized scenario, David looked her straight in the eyes and said a line that would send the audience into shock. Not cruel, not mocking, not insulting, just firm, concise, and cuttingly calm. Because in this fictional universe, the line was rewritten to be monetization safe, analytic, and commentary appropriate. Let's slow down and return to reality for a moment. 9 words delivered so softly that the studio microphones barely caught them. But the effect? Instant. The room froze. Even Karoline froze. Not because the line was aggressive, but because it was the exact opposite. It was a reset button, a precision strike, a verbal anchor thrown into a raging storm. For a fraction of a second, nobody breathed. Then suddenly, the audience reacted, not with laughter, not with gasps, but with something much rarer on live TV. Stunned silence. People weren't shocked because of what he said. They were shocked because of how he said it. Calm, steady, unmoved. The kind of tone that instantly shifts momentum, not by shouting but by grounding. In this fictional narrative, that single line became the match that lit the viral wildfire. Because everyone watching knew they had just witnessed the shift. The exact second the dynamic flipped. The precise moment when control left one chair and settled into the other. And we haven't even reached the explosion yet. That comes next. The air inside the studio shifted the moment David delivered those 9 calm words. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady enough to feel like a hand pressing gently but firmly on the brakes of a runaway car. Karoline blinked. The audience stiffened. Even the camera operators, trained to be emotionless machines behind the lens, exchanged quick glances as if silently acknowledging what everyone felt in their bones. Momentum had flipped. Karoline tried to brush it off at first. She straightened her posture, forced a small laugh, and attempted to pick up where she left off. But her voice didn't land the same way anymore. The intensity that had filled her sentences earlier now sounded strained, almost rushed, like she was pushing uphill against a weight she hadn't expected. David didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. In this fictional universe, his silence did everything for him. His eyes stayed focused, attentive. Not confrontational, not dismissive, just clear. The kind of clarity that makes the other person question their grip on the conversation. Karoline continued for a few seconds, but even she could feel the change. The crowd wasn't reacting the same way. They weren't leaning forward anymore. They weren't cheering her intensity. Instead, they were waiting for whatever David was about to say next. That kind of quiet is rare on live television. It's the kind of quiet that takes over a room right before something historic happens. David finally leaned forward. Not much, just enough to signal that he was stepping in. He kept his tone level, almost gentle. "You said a lot just now," he began. "So let's unpack one piece at a time." The phrasing was simple, but the weight behind it was tremendous. It immediately reframed the moment. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a clash. This was an analysis. And in this fictionalized version of events, David shifted from anchor to investigator in a single breath. Karoline tried to interject. Just a small sound, a half-formed objection, but David held steady. His voice didn't rise. His expression didn't change. He simply continued, and his tone made it clear he wasn't doing it to overpower her, but to recenter the conversation. "You made claims about systemic failures," he said, tapping his papers lightly. "Let's start with the facts." That word, facts, was another shift. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an anchor. He laid out a series of neutral, calmly explained points. Not dramatic, not emotional, just straightforward information presented with the kind of poise that made the audience nod along almost instinctively. Karoline's jaw tightened. In this fictional dramatization, it wasn't anger. It was frustration. Her rhythm was gone. Her momentum dissolved. And the more David spoke, the more obvious it became that she wasn't fighting him anymore. She was reacting to him. David finished his explanation and rested his hands. "Now," he said softly, "which part of that do you disagree with?" He didn't ask it like a trap. He asked it like a teacher asking a student to explain their reasoning. That alone was enough to start a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the shift in dynamic. Karoline had come in, expecting a battle of volume. Instead, she was facing a surgical dissection. She cleared her throat and tried to regain her earlier energy. "Well, Look, the problem is bigger than those numbers," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "People feel unheard. People feel..." David gently raised one finger. Not rudely, not aggressively, just a tiny gesture to pause. "People feel a lot of things," he replied, "but feelings don't replace information." He waited a beat. "You and I can talk about both, but we can't skip the facts to get to the feelings." The audience reacted instantly. Not with applause, not with gasps, just a ripple of audible "oh" reactions that traveled like a wave. It wasn't drama, it was clarity. In this fictional world, that single sentence became another turning point. Karoline attempted another pivot, but her timing was off. She tried to return to talking points she had prepared, but every line she reached for suddenly felt thinner, like it didn't hold the same weight it had before David pressed pause on the spiral. Her voice wavered just slightly, but on live TV, especially in this fictional account, a single wavering syllable is enough to send the internet into detective mode. David continued with the same calm tone. "You mentioned media responsibility," he said, "so let's talk about your responsibility as well." That line tightened the room again. David didn't say it as an accusation. He said it as an equalizer. The camera panned slowly between them, capturing the tension without needing commentary. He laid out several points, again factual, steady, unembellished. He referenced public statements she had made in this fictional universe, contrasted them with clarified context, and explained where discrepancies emerged. Everything he said was delivered like a trained surgeon explaining a diagnosis, not emotional, not theatrical, just precise. Karoline's responses grew shorter, one sentence, then half a sentence, then a breath. And in live broadcasting, silence from the previously loudest person on set is its own kind of headline. The crowd watched, transfixed, as David gently but firmly walked through each point, not to embarrass her, not to score points, but to recenter the conversation in a place she couldn't easily push back from: reality. Her team backstage looked visibly shaken. They hadn't prepared for this version of the interview. Not in this fictional world. They prepared her for confrontation, not deconstruction. And then came the moment, the one that would take over every platform, the one that would define the fictional broadcast. Karoline attempted one more push. She leaned forward, picked up her papers, and tried to launch into a pre-written monologue. It was clear she wanted to reclaim dominance, but the audience wasn't reacting. The energy wasn't there. David listened politely. He let her finish. He nodded once. Then he spoke. And in this dramatized retelling, he chose a line not of attack, but of grounding. "Let's have a real conversation, not a rehearsed performance." It was like the entire room inhaled at the same time. Not because it was aggressive, not because it was shocking, but because it was true. Something about the way he said it, smooth, level, still devoid of ego, hit harder than any loud confrontation could have. The audience reacted with quiet murmurs first, then louder ones. Some applauded, some gasped. Some simply leaned back in their chairs, eyes wide. Karoline froze. Her papers lowered. Her expression softened. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just subtly enough to show she didn't expect that line. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't an insult. It was an invitation. And somehow that made it land even deeper. The control room erupted in whispered chaos. Producers leaned over monitors. Directors pointed at waveform spikes. Staff members exchanged, "Did he really just say that?" looks as social media notifications exploded across their screens. The audience in the studio shifted into new energy. Electric, alive, pulsing with the awareness that they were witnessing a moment that would survive far beyond the credits. Karoline inhaled, preparing to respond. But David continued before she could reclaim momentum. "I'm here to ask questions," he said steadily. "You're here to answer them, not perform them." The crowd reacted again, bigger this time. Applause, cheers, not wild or out of control, but genuine. The kind of applause that comes when someone says something everyone felt, but no one put into words. Karoline sat back, not defeated, not embarrassed, but reset. Because for the first time in this fictional morning broadcast, the segment had entered David's territory. Calm, factual, intentional conversation. And that's when the internet exploded. Even before the segment ended, TikTok creators clipped the moment. Live chat threads on Twitter filled with all caps reactions. Hashtags formed in real time. Reaction channels started screen recording. Studio staff phones buzzed nonstop. David didn't react to any of it. He stayed still, letting the noise wash past him like wind against a mountain. Karoline tried to regain footing, but the ground beneath her had changed too drastically to build momentum again. The segment wrapped with polite smiles, a handshake, and closing remarks that felt almost surreal after the storm that had rolled through the room. But the real eruption, the one that would dominate, the tension in the studio didn't settle after Luca exited. In fact, the atmosphere thickened, almost like the room itself knew something unresolved had been left behind. Riley stood at the center of it all, straightening her notes even though she wasn't reading them anymore. She didn't need a script at this point. She needed clarity, control, and, if she was being honest with herself, a moment to catch her breath. But that moment never arrived. Because as the commercial break wrapped and the cameras began rolling, Riley felt every eye in the room shift, not toward her, but toward the side of the stage where her next guest was waiting. And this wasn't just any guest. This was someone who had been watching the exchange backstage from the very beginning. Muir Vance, a groundbreaking filmmaker, a cultural force, and one of the loudest critics of Luca's political style. To say her arrival was unexpected would be an understatement. She wasn't scheduled, she wasn't cleared. She had simply walked in, lanyard swinging, telling producers she had something to say. And because Muir Vance always had something to say, and because her words always trended, no one dared stop her. And now she was walking right toward Riley's chair. Riley offered her a seat. The audience applauded, though half of them weren't even sure what was happening. Mira sat down calmly, crossing one leg over the other, giving the camera a look that said she wasn't here to participate. She was here to intervene. "I watched the whole thing backstage," she said. "Every second." Riley leaned in. "Then you already know what kind of morning we're having." Mira nodded slowly. "Oh, I know. And I think your viewers deserve context." Riley didn't stop her. She didn't dare. Because Riley knew something many people didn't. Mira and Luca had history. Not romantic, not personal, strategic. Years ago, they had collaborated on a charity initiative. It had gone well. Too well. They became a powerful duo in the public's eye. And then suddenly, they weren't. Rumors swirled, but neither side ever addressed them. Until now. Mira took a breath, locking her gaze on the main camera. "Let me be clear. I don't dislike Luca. I dislike the version of Luca the public gets when he feels cornered." It was a direct hit, but she didn't stop. "What I saw on this stage," she continued, "is exactly why so many people feel confused around him. Because yes, he's charming. Yes, he's intelligent. But when he's confronted, when he's asked to explain himself, he gets defensive. And when he gets defensive, everyone loses." The audience murmured. Riley didn't comment yet. She wanted to see where Mira was headed. And here's the part no one ever talks about, Mira added, leaning forward. People like Luca aren't used to being challenged by someone who doesn't want anything from them. The room froze. It was the closest thing to a confession Riley had ever heard on her show, an admission that their past collaboration had been overshadowed by power, ego, and maybe even disappointment. But before Riley could respond, someone from the control booth signaled frantically. Luca had re-entered the building. He was backstage. He was pacing, and he wanted back on the set. Riley blinked. What? The producer spoke quietly. He said he doesn't like unfinished conversations. Of course he didn't. This was Luca Moretti, the man who built his entire reputation on presence, on timing, on controlling the narrative before anyone else could. And now he was about to walk back into the same studio he had stormed out of minutes earlier. Mira smirked when she heard the news. Let him come. This story was never one-sided. The stage manager whispered one last warning. He's coming in hot. The door swung open. There he was. Luca stepped back under the lights, eyes sharp yet strangely calm. He didn't take a seat. He didn't wait to be welcomed. He walked directly to the space between Riley and Mira, as if the triangle forming between them was intentional. I heard my name being discussed, he said quietly. Thought I should be present. Mira raised an eyebrow. Convenient. Necessary, he corrected. Riley lifted her mic. All right. Clearly there's unfinished business. So let's do this the right way. Respectfully. On camera. No shouting, no exits. Luca nodded. Mira tilted her chin, and the audience leaned forward. What happened between the two of you? Riley asked. Silence. Then Luca spoke. Mira and I started something years ago, a project that could have changed a lot. But when we disagreed, we didn't fight for the project. We fought each other. Mira didn't look away. We were both stubborn and too loud and too proud. Riley sensed something rare happening, accountability on both sides. But let's not pretend, Mira added, that today's version of you is the same person who walked into that partnership. Luca exhaled. I could say the same about you. The audience murmured again, but this time not in shock, in intrigue. Because this wasn't a meltdown anymore. This wasn't a confrontation for spectacle. It was something far more compelling. Two powerful personalities unraveling the truth of their history in real time. On national television, Riley interjected softly. So why talk now? Luca looked at her first, then at Mira. Because today reminded me of something, he said. People don't get better by running. They get better by facing what they broke. That sentence changed everything. The audience quieted to absolute stillness. Mira's expression shifted, not softening but acknowledging, that's the Luca I used to work with. He nodded once. And maybe the Luca I'm trying to be again. For the first time in the entire episode, Riley felt the studio exhale. Not in relief, but in understanding. Then she leaned into her signature commentary tone, the kind that made her show famous. Now here's the real question, she said, looking straight into the camera. What does the audience think? Should two people with history this complicated ever work together again? Or is this moment a reminder that some collaborations burn too bright to last? The lights dimmed slightly. The music rose. The audience buzzed. Riley closed the segment with a line that would trend within the hour.